everybody and welcome to Let's Code Java. Today in this video we will be going over Unit 6 arrays, which carries a weight of 10 to 15% of the multiple choice exam, which is about 15 questions on the multiple choice and 2 questions on the FRQ. Before we move on, something I would like to point out is that all the resources and information blurbs that you will see in my PowerPoint today, they all come directly from the College Board course and exam description. So without further ado, let's begin. Okay, so what to focus on? Well, this is very important because out of this unit, you should be able to create, traverse, and manipulate elements, make decisions about which loop structure is most effective. So we had been using for loops and while loops all this time, but we will now be introduced to something called the enhanced for loop, which works in a similar manner as the for loop, but is a little different, and we're going to look into that. You should be able to identify and correct errors and know the out of bounds error, which is when the program tries to access an element that is beyond the range of elements. And then you should be able to, come up with how you should be familiar with how existing algorithms work for the free response. Okay, so the topics we will cover are all the subtopics that come under Unit 6. Okay, so right at the bat, 6.1. So at the top, these 2 lines show how your array should be structured. So it should begin with the type of the array, followed by 2 square brackets, that followed by the name, equals the keyword new, which creates a new memory location, the type, and then the num elements. So this could be seen here. So you can clearly see in the example how we have the int as the type, followed by the square brackets, followed by the name, which could be anything, equals new int, and the length. And remember, arrays are used to group large amounts of data into a single data structure, right? So they make code more efficient. And also, arrays have a fixed type and size. So if you have made an array of type int, you cannot add any elements that are not int into the array. And the size is fixed too, so you can't manipulate it. This is important to know because in the next unit we will be, or the unit after, we will be looking at array lists, which do involve the changing of size and type, which we are going to look at later. And then arrays can store both primitive or object reference data. And then there's the other type of array known as the initializer array, which are used to create and initialize arrays. So essentially they're the same thing, except this time you're already putting in the elements into the array. And then you have the array variable name, which holds a reference to the memory location of where the array is stored. Okay, so declaring or creating arrays. So declaring array is not the same as creating one, right? So declaring array is double square brackets price. However, creating is when you say new double 12, right? So creating is when you allocate the specific spaces for the specific number of elements that you need in your array. Now remember, arrays are objects. They are not variables, they're objects. And so they hold reference to objects. So basically, when you create an object, right? When you create an object, it tends to hold references to its memory location. But when you don't create an object, it doesn't hold any reference, so it holds a value of null, right? So whenever you're going to print an array that hasn't been created, it's going to print out null. Now to create an array, you use the keyword new, right, which creates new memory as I mentioned earlier, and then an initializer list used to set up values if you already know your values in advance. Finally, an array with primitive data allocates spaces for the specific values. However, for objects, you don't really store these specific objects into the array spaces because remember, objects, right, they have a lot of parts to them. Objects are just way too big. They can take up way too much space inside that's one variable, right? So that's why we just hold the reference to their memory locations inside the array. Okay. I just found this meme funny and I think you guys will too. So there's the English teacher saying it's semicolon. We'll hardly use it, right? But then the computer science student goes, oh yeah, totally. Because remember, semicolon plays a huge role in our coding. Anyways, whatever. Okay, so array.length. Array.length is the instance variable declared as public final int that stores the length of the array, right? So array.length is different from string.length because you guys may have noticed, right, with string objects, you guys or us, we normally include the two brackets because in the case of string objects, it's usually a method. String.length is a method, but then in the case of arrays, it's just a variable. So that's something to note as well. Okay. So now arrays as parameters. Okay, so normally when we pass in something, right, usually a primitive data type, into a method, what happens is the method makes a copy of that primitive data type, and then we manipulate the copy, but the actual value stays the same. However, with arrays, they're objects, and so they hold a reference to the object, right, or to the object's memory location. And so that's why when you pass in an array as the parameter, the method actually ends up modifying the array itself, because we can't really make another copy of array because they take way too much space. Like I mentioned, they're objects, and it's really hard to make another copy of something that's way too big. And so no copy of arrays are made, right? And so we simply use their object references and we access or modify it. And so again, like I mentioned earlier, arrays can store either primitive data or object reference data. And so just to refresh it in your brain if you have forgotten, primitive data type would be your boolean, char, int, and double. And non-primitive data type would be your string. Array, notice that array comes under non-primitive data type because it's an object class, and then interface. Now, when an array is created, all of its, like with the keyword new, right, all of its elements are initialized. So with a specific value. So if it's of type int, all the values are initialized to 0. If it's of type double, the elements are initialized to 0.0. If it's boolean, it's going to be false. However, when it's going to be object, and since it's going to be object, it's going to be holding references, right? It's going to be holding references to the object's memory locations. It's going to initialize all of those specific values to null because you can't really automatically create objects, right? It's kind of hard to imagine like creating objects by themselves. You kind of have to like set everything up, in advance or after. So that is that. And then know the array index out of bounds exception. And I'm just going to take off, or I don't know, but anyway, so just know the array index out of bounds exception, which is and this error comes when you use an index that is outside the range, and the range only goes from 0 through 1 less than the number of elements in the array, right? So if you try to access any index that is outside of the range 0 to array.length minus 1, you are in trouble because that would then cause the array index out of bounds exception. So in this picture right here at the bottom, I have included an example of an array index out of bounds exception error. So you can see how I start from 0, that's okay. But then I go from 0 all the way to array.length and I use less than or equals to. Now notice that in arrays we start always from 0. So we always end up at a position less than the actual length, right? So it may seem obvious, oh yeah, the length of this array is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 because there are 5 elements. But then remember, we don't start at 1, we start at 0 in an array, so it's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And so there's nothing at that 5th position, and so it's gonna cause that index out of bound error, and this is also known as the off by 1 error because here I'm off by 1. Okay. So now let's look at the square brackets. Well, the square brackets are used to access and modify an element in a 1D array, right? So over here, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to swap the elements at indices 0 and 1. And so what I do is firstly, I store the value of the element at index 0 in a variable, and then I modify the value of the first element after when I set it equal to the value at the first index. So 3 now becomes 5, and then I take the value, whatever value is at first index, so 5, and I equal that to the temp variable, which right now stores the value of 3. So now this becomes 3, and so these two elements are successfully swapped. So this is all to demonstrate how you can use square brackets to access an element in modified 2. Okay, so now let's look at 6.2, which will be traversing arrays. Okay, so again, we use for loops and while loops to traverse arrays. In the first picture, we can see how we start at 0, and we do I is less than length of array, because we only loop till array.length minus 1. And then here we are using a loop counter, I, right? Because it's going to increment each time, and for every value, for every index, right, that comes from between or within the range 0 to array name.length minus 1, it's going to print out each of the elements in the array at that index. And here I'm using a while loop with a counter again, right? So it's doing the same thing as this loop, except here we were using a for loop, and here we were using a while loop. And again, we're using a counter in each of the loops. Okay, so now let's look at 6.3, enhanced for loops for arrays. Now remember, just pay attention to this last bit of information that says that program code written using an enhanced for loop, right, to traverse and access elements can be rewritten using an index for loop or a while loop. So it's very important, right? Not everything that is written using a for loop or a while loop can be written using an enhanced for loop. However, the reverse of that applies correctly. So anything that you write in for each loop can always, or enhanced for loop can always be written into for and while loop, but not the same the other way. Okay, so the for each loop, or the enhanced for loop, for now I'll call it the for each loop. So the way you read the statement right here is you say for each item in array, and so the structure that it follows is for the data type, any variable, you can honestly call it anything, and the name of the array, right? So what I did here is I created a for loop, and then I created a for each loop, right? So in the for loop, again, the traditional for loop, I print out each of the elements in array, but then in a for each loop, I do the same thing, except this time I say for int I, so that's the data type of the array, I, right? So that's the variable, in array, so that's my array name, system.out.println I. Notice that I don't have to access the index here, because when you declare this temporary variable into the for each loop, it automatically accesses each of the elements in the array. So notice that they both print out the same thing. However, you cannot use the for each loop every time, because the thing is, with the for each loop, you can see that it doesn't let you access the index. So every time you need to use the index in your code, for each loop would not be appropriate. And the other thing is that the for each loop, no matter what you do, it always loops through all of the elements in the array. So if you happen to be in a situation where you have to only code through some of the array or part of the array, for each loop would not be appropriate in that case, because it loops through all of the elements. And then in the case that you have to modify the values, right, for each loop can't really modify the values. It only accesses the values and prints it out or does something that doesn't involve modifying. So yeah, that is the for each loop, and that is the things you have to keep in mind. Okay, and finally 6.4, developing algorithms using arrays. Okay, so essential knowledge, you can go through those things, but we're going to go through each of those things in the next few slides, and these are some things you need to know for the FRQ. So firstly, determining the min and max. So we can look at this code right here, which tries to find the largest value among these three values in the array. And so the way we accomplished that, at least the way I coded this myself, was I made three values, right? I said, okay, the first value would be the, element at index 0. and I do that using square brackets, right? I access the value using square brackets. Then I say, okay, my mid value is going to be at nums.length divided by 2, right? The length is 3, so if I divide by 2, it would be 1. And so 0, 1, the, middle index is 2, which is right. And then I say, okay, my last value would be nums.length minus 1. So that makes sense. And so what I do is I temporarily store the middle value into my largest variable. And then I do a bunch of conditions. So if I say, okay, well, this is the largest value. However, if it's less than the first value, then make the first value the largest. And if that is less than the last value, then make the last value the largest. So again, in the end, these FRQ problems, these little coding problems, it's just a matter of, using your logic and how you would approach these problems in real world and applying that to code. And this is computing the sum, average, or mode. So we look at the first one where you return the sum of all the elements. So honestly, I could have also used a for each loop here because I'm not really modifying the value. I'm just adding it to this variable sum. So I'm saying for, because I already know, because they already told me that the length of each of the array would be 3. I just said, okay, I'll loop from 0 to less than 3. And then I would add each of the values of num, the array, to the variable sum, and then I would return the sum, right? So just be familiar with these problems. And then the other one that I actually coded was the average one. So what I did was, I created an array, and I also created a variable 0. So the same thing, right? And you can see that I used a for each loop here because, again, I'm not modifying the values. I'm just adding it to count. So you can see that this part of this code and this part of this code, they're exactly the same. But for the average, you take the sum and then you divide it by, the number of items. So I just divided by array.length here. Also notice here I, declared it as int, but then here I have declared the variable as double because, again, division could result in a floating point value. So for that reason, I made it a double. You could have also cast it, by the way. And then this is the one element has property. So again, you need to be familiar with, how to be able to code such problems. So return true if it contains a 2 or a 3. So the way I coded it is that I run my code from 0 to nums.length minus 1, and I say that if the value is equal to 2 or if it's equal to 3, return true. If it's not, return false. And then all elements have properties. So in the last example, we were just looking if any of the values have, a 2, or if any of the values are 2 or 3, return true. But in this case, we're looking for if every element has a certain property. So return true if every element is a 1 or a 4. So in this case, what I do is I hold a counter variable, right, which keeps track of how many values are either a 1 or a 4. And if that matches the length of the array, then return true, else return false. And this is just another one of those examples where it says that, you return true for every pair, right? If for every pair in the, set of numbers, at least one of the numbers in the pair is this value right here. And so the way I do it is, I code through all the values and I'm like, okay, if the first value is not equal to this number and if the second value is not equal to this number, return false. And if it is, then return true. Okay. And again, if any of these problems are confusing, please note down in the comments below. I would love to go through them again or clarify any of your doubts. But this video is just meant to be a quick review of everything you need to know for Unit 6. So that's why you may find me going through everything a little bit. But just pay attention to these pictures that I put because these are examples that correspond directly to what College Board has mentioned on the course and exam description, which is the best way you can study for the AP exam. But so back to this, so consecutive pairs of elements. So let's look at the first code. So it says, given an int array length 3, if there's a 2 in the array immediately followed by a 3, set the 3 element to 0, right? So for example, in the first code, we see that yes, there is a 2 immediately. There is a 2 immediately followed by a 3. So we said that, 3 to 0. Again, there's a 2 immediately followed by 3. So we set the 3 to 0. And so again, very similar to the logic in the for loop, I say, okay, go through all the elements, and if the first element is 2 and then the element right after is a 3, set that element to 0 and then return the array. So it's really all about logic. And here it has 22, so you have to return true if there's an array that contains 2 next to a 2. So I say, okay, go through all the numbers, and I say if nums I equals 2, right? So if the value is 2 and the value before it is also 2, then set this temporary variable to true. Now remember, I also put I is greater than 0 here so that I don't go out of range. And so yeah, this is how I ensure that the values right next to each other are 2s, and I return true for the following. Right, you will notice that for the first index I equals 0, it will basically skip this conditional because I will be equal to 0 at the first time that it goes through, and it will not really satisfy this condition, and so it's going to skip the first time. But the second time, when it's going to increment to a 1, then it's going to actually hold the statement true or false based on whatever values the arrays hold, and based on that it's gonna manipulate the Boolean variable found. Okay, so let's go through absence or presence of duplicate elements. Okay, so basically I take 2 arrays here and I say, well, okay, I set 2 for loops here, and the reason why is because I loop through the elements of the first array, so that's gonna be 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then what the second for loop does is it loops through all the elements of the second list. So in the first example, or in the first call, I pass in the first list and the second list as the parameters. So I take the first list, right? So that would be my first for loop. And then for my second for loop, what I do is I say, okay, the second for loop will, execute all of its values, and it's going to compare all of its values to the first value of the first array, and if any of these values are equal to this, then we're going to set is duplicate to true, or otherwise to false. And at some point what it's going to do is it's going to then go through the second value, and again it's going to do comparison, and at some point it's going to realize, oh yeah, 2 is equal to 2, and so we're going to set that is duplicate variable right there to 0. Or sorry, to true, my bad. And so it's going to return true, which it did for the first time. For the second time, I passed in list 1 and 3. Notice that list 1 and list 3 do not have any values in common, and so it printed out false, right? So again, it follows the same method I just explained. And in the same manner, it looks for any duplicates. If there are no duplicates, it returns false. Okay, num elements meeting criteria. So again, you can pause the video and read through in more detail if you'd like. These problems are all borrowed from Coding Bets. But so anyways, this problem keeps track of the number of even numbers, or the number of even elements in the array. So what I do is I again have a counter, and I say that, for loop through all the elements, and if any of the elements, if you divide them by 2 and the remainder is 0, then increment count because they have to be even, and then return the counter because that'll tell us the number of elements that are even. Then reversing the order. Okay, so with reverse the order, okay. So with reverse the order, again, you're reversing the order. So again, simple logic. What I do is I create a new array with the same length as nums. And what I do is I loop backwards, right? I loop backwards. And what I do is I say, and I hold this variable count, and what I do is, since count is holding the value 0 right now, I say that the first position, the first element of 0 is going to be the last element of nums. Right, so take a moment to pause the video and realize why exactly, because count is equal to 0, remember, and I here is equal to nums.length minus 1. So we're equaling the first element to the last element, right? Then count is going to increment to 1. Then we're going to hold the second, then we're going to make the second element of reverse the second last element of nums, right? And then the third element of reverse the third last elements of nums. And that way, right, the list will actually end up being backwards. Then this is shifting or rotating elements left to right. So again, here we're shifting left. So shifting left in the sense we're moving all of these values in the array back one. So you see that 2 was first here, but then it comes here. And then 5 comes in 2's place, 3 comes in 5's place, and 6 goes all the way at the end, right? So again, what I do here is, firstly, if any of the, arrays are less than length 2, then I just simply return the list. And then what I do is, it's kind of hard to go from 0 to length minus 1 using a for loop. So I store the value of 0, or whatever element is at position 0, into a variable temp. And then using the for loop, what I do is I move everything 1. So I'm like, okay, whatever element is at 6, well, now it's going to equal whatever element is at 2, or I plus 1. And so that way I move everything up. And then at the end, I didn't capture this in the picture, but then at the end what I do is I equal this temp variable to nums.length minus 1, or to the last index, so that the 6 comes here. Same thing for rotate left 3. For rotate left 3, what you do is you bring the last 2 elements up 1, right? So 2, 3 jump 1 up their position, and the element at the first index comes at the end. So again, it's basically the same thing. I start at index 1, which is this index right here, and what I do is I'm like, the position that is before it will now, have the value that is at this position, so it's 2, and then for 3 it's gonna now come to the position before it, and then whatever position is at the last, that will now hold the value of the element that is at position 1, and then we're gonna return the array. So okay, this is a mistake that I did. So on the FRQ, be sure to whenever you want to retrieve the name of a horse object, or retrieve any of the properties of an object, you can't just directly do it. You have to call the getter method getName, because the specific properties of the horse object or its attributes are stored in as private instance variables, so you can't really directly call them. You have to use the getter methods to call their specific names, so like get name or get whatever attributes. So you have to use getter methods to access those private variables. This is a mistake that I did, and I thought to share it with you guys, because I thought, since if I did it, then other people are likely to do it as well, and so something to keep in mind. And then this other mistake I did was, so you can read the problem, you can pause the video and read the problem, but so basically this problem at first to me seemed really complicated, and I was like, oh my god, how in the world am I ever gonna solve for it? But then I realized that they already provided the method to me that actually solved the complicated part of the problem. I just had to code the more easier part. So just make sure to pay attention to the questions, right? Because sometimes they may seem complicated, but they're not as complicated as we think. So now time to practice. Okay. So again, this is not, and in no way is an exhaustive list of practice problems. There could obviously be more, and I encourage you that you go to Coding Bats, you go to College Board. They have listed a lot of resources under each unit, and that you ask your teacher to provide you, or give you access to some FRQ or multiple choice practice or progress checks on College Board, and they will certainly help you or benefit you greatly. So here's the first practice problem. Hang on. So here's the first practice problem. Pause the video and have a go at it. Okay, so hopefully you had a go at it. Okay, so the first one would be 0 because, again, remember that our arrays, right, the first element always starts at 0. The next one, it says at index 0 and 2, which of the values would be. So again, it starts at 0, the array, right, and then 2, 3. Remember, the length of this might be 4, but then it always starts at 0. So look, from the index perspective, it would, just be until 3. So 0, 1, 2, 3. So 4 and 8 would be the correct answers. And then which index is the last element? That would be highest score dot length minus 1, as we have already explored that earlier in the slides. So yeah. And then have a go at these problems. Okay, so assuming you did have a go at it, which I do encourage you highly. So the first problem, it may seem like really complicated and big. It's really not. So it's asking you, consider the following instance variables and incomplete method. So which of the following statements is true for whatever the code is here, right? So what I did first was I read the answer choices. It said they're working as intended, or one is faster than the other, or they're equally fast, or one will cause the array index out of bounds exception error. And so what I do is I first take a good look at the code, right? And just by having a good look at the code, the first thing that I noticed is in implementation 1 is that it's nice how it starts at 0 and it goes through array.length minus 1. But what you'll see is the first time that'll loop at index 0, it's gonna do sum j minus 1. Now remember, j minus 1 would be 0 minus 1, which would be minus 1, and minus 1 would be an out of range index, so you can't really access that index. And so the answer would be implementation 1 does not work as intended because it will cause an array index out of bounds exception error. And then here you have to create an array of integers named data of size 5 with the following content. So you're just going to say int square brackets data, and then you would just open, close parentheses, and inside these parentheses would go all your elements that they have listed on that line right there. Hopefully you get it. And then it says here to swap the first and the last elements, which I explored earlier in the video. So the way you do it is you can first declare a temporary variable temp and equal that to swap ends, and SE is short for swap ends. And this should actually be a bracket, my bad. This should actually be a bracket. So bracket 0, so the first element. And then what I do is I say, okay, the first element, right, I've already stored its previous value. So the first element, I'm now going to modify it to the last element. So I say, okay, now it's equal to the last element, which would be SE, right, and inside
that SE dot length minus 1, right, and then whatever, and then at SE dot length minus 1, at that index position, we will store the value of temp. So this way we have successfully swapped
the two values. Okay, so let's go through this problem. Just pause the video and have a look at it, and then we're going to solve it together. Okay, so it says to write a method that keeps the track of the longest run, which is basically the maximum number of occurrences of a number. So here we see that 2 and 5 make up the maximum number of occurrences of 4, right? So either you'll have to print out 2 or you'll have to print out 5. So you'll have to keep track of the maximum number of occurrences and which number, right, has the maximum number of occurrences in the array. So, okay. So I just included a block version of this code. So what we do is we first have a current length, which holds the current length variable. We have a max length, which is going to hold the maximum length, and then max start, which is going to hold the I guess index position, or no, the number which occurs the most number of times. So we loop through all the values minus 1, so 1 less. And what we do is we compare. So we compare the value at index 0 to the value right after. And if they both are the same, we increment count by 1, right? And if at any time current len exceeds max len's value, we set max len to current len. And then our max start would be I minus current len plus 1, right? And this makes sense because think about it, right? Back to our coding problem, let's say we are at this position right here in our for loop, right? And we have found that, 4 definitely exceeds that of the max len, right? Max len's value, right? And so what we do is that we look at, 2 is that max start. So we do, so for max start, we do I minus current len plus 1. So I at that position would be 9 minus current length, which would be 4. So that would be 9 minus 4, 5. So we would be here. And then it would add 1 to it, so we would come to 6, which would give us the correct value, 2. So that makes sense. Else current len equals 0, because obviously, they're not going to be equal to each other. Our series of occurrences now ends, and so we're going to equal that to 0. And then, even though we are going to set our current len to 0, our max len is still going to be that highest number that we stored in it. And then we're going to end up returning max start. Okay, so have a go at these problems. Okay, so I hid the answers of the problems earlier. Okay, so the first question says, well, we have this array, and if it goes through this method, then what will it print out? Well, let's think about it. It starts at a.length divided by 2. So that means we're going to start at a.length divided by 2. So that would be, so the length is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If we divided by 2, it would be 3. So at 3, we have 0, 1, 2, 3. We have the value of 4. And for all the values till the end, we're going to times each value by 2. And so this would become 8, this would become 16, and this would become 60. And realize that the values before 4 stay unchanged. So that way, C should be the correct option. And then for this one, it says which of the following statements would hold true, which of the following, conditions will return true. So for this one, it goes through all the elements, and what it does is, each time we do a comparison, the value of temp changes, right? If they both are equal, it's true. If they both are not equal, it says false, right? So just try to remember, right? Not remember, try to visualize that, how it'll look like. So if you take an array, right, and if you go through each of its elements and if you compare it to val, right, at some point it will equal and it'll hold the value of true. At some points it's not gonna be equal and it's not gonna hold the value of true. It's gonna be false. So the value of temp will go from true, false, true, false, true, false, till the very last value, right? And whatever that last value will be. So if that last element will equal val, then temp is going to be true. But if that last element will not equal val, then this would be false. And right after that last comparison, the for loop is going to end. And whatever that most latest or recent value of temp was, that will be returned. So if you look at it from that perspective, C should be the correct answer. Okay, so do this problem real quickly and we'll go through it. Okay, so here we're trying to find what is this method actually doing, right? What value will it return? So again, kind of similar to what we, the kind of FRQ practice we did earlier in this PowerPoint. So we have a variable len count, which keeps track of the current consecutive numbers length. Equals 0, we have the maximum length. And then what we do is, we do if nums k, or whatever that element is, if it equals target, we, increment this count by 1, right? So right when I see it, I know that what it's doing is it's, keeping track of how many occurrences of target are in this array. So what I do is, I say, if len count is greater than max len equals len count. And if len count is greater than max len equals len count. And then in both cases, I'm equaling max len to len count, and then return max len. So basically, max len is the number of occurrences of value target in nums. Okay. I actually haven't tried these on my own, so we'll see how it goes and exactly what procedures, or not procedures, exactly what approach I use to solve these problems. So for the first one, it says fix the following code so that it prints every other value. So every other value in the array starting with the value at index 0. Okay, so right now, alright, it's pretty messed up. So the first thing we need to do is we need to make this less than, not less than equals to, because remember, the last element is air1.length minus 1, not air1.length, so we can't really do air1.length, right? And then it says index plus equals 2. Okay, that's fine. And this system.out.print index. Okay, so we're gonna print 1, and then we're gonna print 7. Let's see if this works. Oh, there's an error. Okay, hang on. Every other value starting with the value at index 0. Okay, it's gonna print 0. Wait, what? Oh, remember, this is an array, so we cannot just do int air1. We have to also include the 2 brackets, right, to indicate that this is an array. And we still have something not right. Hang on. Oh, my bad. Okay, so this should be air1. This is literally my first time doing these problems, so I'm a little confused. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Oh, it should be good after this. 1, 7, 15. Yeah, what's wrong with that now? Oh, okay, that's good. All right. Let's look at the other one. So it says fix the following to print the values in the array, starting with the value. Okay, and then backwards. Okay. Okay, so we're gonna print it backwards. So a1.length minus 1. Again, it can't be that. So as long as I system.out.println air, it's not gonna be air. It's actually gonna be a1 because that's the name of our array. And everything seems fine to me now. Oh, the thing is, if we do less than 0, then it's gonna skip this value, right? But we wanted to also include that, so we're gonna put less than or equals to, and that should hopefully bring it all correct. That's awesome, I love this. Okay, rewrite the following code so that it prints all the values in an array using a for each loop. Okay, no problem. So we're gonna just take this and we're gonna say for int element, or we can say int I in air1. We're gonna system.out.println We're gonna system.outprintln I, and that should be good. Okay, finish the following code so that it prints out all of the odd values. Cool. So we're gonna say for each value, if value mod 2 equal 1, system.out.println value. Hopefully just gonna make sure that we have a fair number of brackets, and that should be good. Cool. The next one says finish the following method to return the sum of all values. Okay, so got some. Oh, they haven't written the method. Okay, so we're just gonna take an error, right, and we're gonna say for, and we're actually not modifying the value, so we can actually use a for each loop. So we can say for int I and error sum plus or equals I. And we're gonna return sum. But before we do that, we're gonna make a sum value. That should be okay. The next one says finish the following method to return the sum of all the non-negative values in the past array. So first we're gonna have to check if the value is negative or non-negative, and if it is non-negative, then we're gonna add it to the sum. Cool. So for we can honestly even do this one with a for each loop. So we're gonna say int sum equals 0 for every element. For each element, I'm just gonna say element for the sake of I don't know, comprehension. For every element in air, if element is greater than 0, greater than or equal to 0, honestly, sum plus or equals element, and then we're gonna return the sum. Hopefully this prints out everything right. Oh, okay, I saw that 90 and I was like, what, 90%? Why? And I'm gonna pause the video. And thank you so much for your time. Some extra tips that I've included is one, declaring multiple arrays on one line. So every time you want to declare multiple arrays on one line, you can do so efficiently in an alternative way by just including them on one line, and you can have a look at the example here. And then I would highly encourage you, if you're prepping for that AP exam, to do Code HS questions of the day, because they're very helpful, especially if you're low on time. They post one question a day, and they're just really easy to do. So I would highly encourage you to check out that. And thank you. I'll see you again in my next video. Till then, peace out.